My parents drained their retirement to throw my sister a lavish plaza hotel wedding, tossing me a measly $200 for my own. They thought I was a struggling assistant. They didn't know I secretly owned a $14 million chateau in Provence. Then, the real betrayal began. In every family, there is a dynamic that is established early and rarely broken. In the Harding household, the rule was simple. Wyatt was the sun, and the rest of us were just planets lucky enough to be caught in her orbit. My parents, Richard and Margaret, weren't inherently evil people, but they were hopelessly blinded by their eldest daughter. Wyatt was a former pageant queen, perpetually polished and effortlessly manipulative. I, Claire, was the quiet one, the girl who spent her weekends coding in the basement of our Stamford, Connecticut home while Wyatt was out crashing Daddy's Lexus. By the time we reached our 20s, the roles were permanently set in stone. They saw Wyatt as a delicate flower needing constant financial and emotional cultivation. And they saw me as the sturdy one, a nice way of saying they didn't need to pay attention to me. The peak of this madness arrived when Wyatt announced her engagement to Greg Higgins. Greg was a junior investment banker who wore too much Tom Ford cologne and spoke exclusively in golf metaphors. When he proposed, my parents wept as if royalty had just united our bloodline. "We are giving you the wedding of your dreams, sweetheart," my mother promised over a celebratory dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant, which, ironically, I ended up paying for because my father forgot his wallet. What followed was a masterclass in financial delusion. My parents were comfortably middle class. My dad was a regional manager for a logistics company, and my mom was a retired school administrator. Yet, for Wyatt's wedding, they acted as if they were the Rockefellers. Wyatt demanded the Plaza Hotel in New York City. She demanded a custom Vera Wang gown that required 3 flights to the flagship boutique. She demanded walls of imported white orchids that cost more than my college tuition. The final price tag was a staggering $250,000. To afford this, Richard and Margaret quietly took out a second mortgage on their house and drained the entirety of their retirement savings. I found out about the second mortgage accidentally when I saw a letter from the bank left open on the kitchen counter. When I confronted my father about it, he just sighed, rubbing his temples. "Claire, you don't understand. This is a crucial networking event for Greg. And Wyatt, well, she deserves a fairy tale. You're self-sufficient. You can't grasp the pressure." I was self-sufficient. Hilariously so. What my parents didn't know, because they never bothered to ask, was that the little computer project I started in college had blossomed into a highly lucrative enterprise software company. At 28, I had just sold a minority stake in my business to a Silicon Valley venture firm for an 8-figure sum. I wore plain black turtlenecks and drove a 4-year-old Honda Civic because I liked flying under the radar. They assumed I was barely scraping by as an IT help desk worker. Wyatt's wedding was an exhausting spectacle. As her maid of honor, I was subjected to endless abuses. I was forced to pay $1,800 for a hideous, seafoam green taffeta dress that made me look like a melting mint. When her card declined at the end of her luxurious Tulum bachelorette party, I quietly paid the $6,000 hotel bill so she wouldn't face embarrassment. Did I get a thank you? No. Wyatt told the bridesmaids that the hotel comped the stay because of her Instagram following. On the day of the wedding, as my sister floated around the grand ballroom of the plaza, dripping in diamonds my parents couldn't afford, I stood in the corner, sipping cheap champagne. My mother approached me, her face flushed with expensive wine. "Isn't it magnificent, Claire?" she sighed, wiping away a tear. "Someday, you'll find a nice man too, and we'll help you out. Of course, maybe a nice intimate gathering at the local VFW hall." I just smiled, nodding into my glass. I knew then that I would never, ever ask them for a dime. 2 years after Wyatt's financial ruin of our parents, I met Sebastian. Sebastian was a London-born architect who was as grounded as he was brilliant. We fell in love over shared plates of street food and long debates about modern urban design. He knew about my wealth. But like me, he didn't care to flaunt it. When he proposed on a quiet, rainy Tuesday in our shared apartment, It was the happiest moment of my life. A week later, we drove to Connecticut to share the news with my family. Wyatt and Greg were there, living in my parents' guest room because Greg had temporarily stepped back from finance to find his entrepreneurial spirit. He was unemployed. We sat around the dinner table eating dry pot roast. "Mom, Dad, Wyatt," I began, reaching for Sebastian's hand. "Sebastian and I are engaged." There was a brief silence. My mother managed a tight smile. "Oh, well, isn't that nice? Congratulations, Claire. Let me see the ring," Wyatt demanded, leaning over. Sebastian had designed it himself, a flawless, vintage-cut sapphire flanked by conflict-free diamonds. It was elegant, understated, and incredibly expensive. Wyatt scoffed. "A sapphire? How?" "Quaint. Very alternative, Claire." My father cleared his throat. "Well, Claire, Sebastian, this is good news, but we need to be honest with you." He exchanged a heavy look with my mother. "We are still recovering from Wyatt's wedding. And, with Greg transitioning careers, well, we are helping them out a bit. We can't give you the kind of support we gave your sister." "I totally understand," I said immediately. "We aren't asking for anything." My mother reached into her pocketbook and pulled out a folded check. She slid it across the table toward me. "We want to contribute something, though. To help with the dress, or maybe a deposit on a nice public park pavilion." I opened the check. $200. Next to me, Sebastian's jaw tightened, but I squeezed his knee under the table. I folded the check and put it in my purse. "Thank you, Mom. That's very generous." Wyatt smirked, swirling her wine. "We'll definitely come, Claire, even if it's just a backyard BBQ. Family is family. Right?" "Right," I replied smoothly. "I'll let you know when we finalize the details." What they didn't know was that the details were already finalized. 6 months prior, as an investment and a personal sanctuary, I had purchased Château de Saint-Martial, a breathtaking 18th century estate nestled in the Luberon Valley of Provence, France. It cost $14 million. It sat on 40 acres of lavender fields, century-old olive groves, and featured a sweeping stone staircase that belonged in a period drama. It was my secret hideaway, and it was going to be my wedding venue. 3 months before the wedding, I mailed the invitations. I hired a renowned Parisian calligrapher. The invites were pressed on thick, cotton rag paper with gold leaf edging, sealed with custom wax. I also included round-trip, first-class Air France tickets for my parents, Wyatt and Greg, along with a detailed itinerary of their stay in the estate's private guest suites. I was at my office in Manhattan when my phone started ringing incessantly. It was my mother. "Claire!" she shrieked the moment I answered. "What is this? Are these fake tickets? And this castle? What is going on? Did Sebastian take out loans? You cannot let him put you in debt for a wedding. You don't have this kind of money." "Mum, breathe," I said calmly, swiveling in my Herman Miller chair to look out over the New York skyline. "The tickets are real. The wedding is in Provence. How are you renting a literal French chateau?" Wyatt's voice suddenly echoed through the phone. She had clearly snatched it from my mother. "Do you know how much a week at a place like this costs? It's easily $100,000. Who is paying for this?" "I am," I said. "And I'm not renting it." "Wyatt, what do you mean you aren't renting it?" My father's voice boomed in the background. "I bought it," I said, my voice deadpan. 3 years ago. It's my summer home. I'm hosting the wedding at my house." Silence. Thick, suffocating silence hung on the line. I could practically hear the gears grinding in Wyatt's head, violently short-circuiting as her worldview collapsed. You own a castle in France?" my mother finally whispered, sounding like she was gasping for air. "Claire, you fix computers." "I own a software company, Mom. I told you this 5 years ago, but you told me to stop talking about nerd stuff because it was boring, Greg." I paused, letting the reality sink in. "I expect you all to arrive on the 14th. The chauffeur will pick you up from Marseille Airport. See you then. I hung up. When the 14th arrived, Sebastian and I stood on the gravel driveway of the chateau, waiting for the family to arrive. The estate was looking particularly magnificent that day. The ivory stone gleamed in the southern French sun, and the scent of blooming lavender filled the warm air. A team of florists from Paris was already setting up floral arches that made Wyatt's plaza wedding look like a high school prom. A sleek black Mercedes van pulled up the driveway, crunching over the gravel. The doors slid open. My parents stepped out first. They looked like they had seen a ghost. They stared at the sprawling three-story manor, the perfectly manicured topiary gardens, and the infinity pool overlooking the valley. My father's mouth was literally hanging open. Then Wyatt stepped out. She was wearing oversized sunglasses, but she couldn't hide the visceral, almost sickly shade of green her face had turned. She looked at the chateau, then at my bespoke silk crepe dress, and finally at Sebastian, who was speaking fluent French to the estate manager. "Welcome to Saint-Martial," I said, smiling warmly. Wyatt didn't say hello. She didn't congratulate me. She just gripped her Louis Vuitton bag until her knuckles turned white, her eyes darting around frantically as if looking for a hidden camera. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, brushing past me toward the heavy oak doors. I thought the worst of it would be her typical jealousy. I thought we would just have to endure a week of her passive-aggressive comments. But I severely underestimated just how toxic my family could be when faced with wealth they felt they were entitled to. As the sun set on their first night in Provence, the real nightmare was just beginning. The morning after their arrival, the atmosphere at Château de Saint-Martial was thick with unspoken tension. I woke early, leaving Sebastian sleeping peacefully, and walked down the grand marble staircase to the sunroom overlooking the eastern lavender fields. Jacqueline, my estate manager, had already set out a sprawling breakfast of fresh croissants, local cheeses, and espresso. I was quietly sipping my coffee when my parents and Wyatt descended upon the room. They looked exhausted, likely from spending the entire night Googling my net worth and the property values in the Luberon Valley. Wyatt practically threw herself onto a velvet settee, her eyes scanning the antique tapestries and crystal chandeliers with a mixture of awe and absolute resentment. She wore a silk dressing gown that looked suspiciously new, undoubtedly bought specifically for this trip to keep up appearances. Greg trailed behind her, looking hungover and intimidated by the sheer scale of the wealth surrounding him. My father, Richard, cleared his throat loudly as he took a seat across from me. He didn't comment on the breathtaking view or the fact that his daughter had achieved massive success. Instead, he got straight to business. "Claire," he began, adopting the stern, paternal tone he usually reserved for discussing car maintenance. "Your mother and I stayed up quite late discussing this situation." "Situation?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You mean my wedding?" "We mean this house." "Your money," Margaret chimed in, leaning forward with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You've clearly been hiding a very significant portion of your life from us. We feel incredibly hurt that you didn't trust us enough to share your success." I almost laughed. "Mom, whenever I tried to talk about my software company, you asked if I could fix the printer and then changed the subject to Wyatt's pageants or Greg's golf handicap. I didn't hide anything. You just never cared to look." Wyatt scoffed, violently buttering a croissant. "Oh, please, Claire. Don't play the victim. You purposely kept this a secret so you could spring it on us and humiliate me. You've always been jealous of me." "Jealous?" Sebastian's voice echoed from the doorway. He walked in, looking effortlessly handsome in linen trousers and a casual button-down, slipping his arm around my waist. "Wyatt, with all due respect, Claire owns a $14 million estate and built a tech empire from the ground up. What exactly is she jealous of? Greg's unemployment?" Greg choked on his espresso. Wyatt's face turned a mottled crimson. "Watch your tone, Sebastian," my father snapped. "You may be marrying into this family, but you will respect us. Now, Claire, since we are being transparent, we need to address a family matter. Your mother and I are drowning in debt from the plaza wedding. The second mortgage is crushing our retirement. We are essentially bankrupt. He paused, waiting for me to gasp or offer sympathy. I just took another sip of coffee. Since you are sitting on tens of millions of dollars, my father continued, his voice hardening, we expect you to pay off the mortgage on the Stamford house. It's the least you can do for the family. Furthermore, Greg has a brilliant idea for a boutique financial consulting firm. He needs $300,000 in seed capital. We expect you to write the check before you leave for your honeymoon. I stared at them. The sheer, unadulterated audacity was staggering. They weren't asking. They were demanding. They felt entirely entitled to the wealth I had built through 80-hour work weeks simply because we shared a bloodline. Let me get this straight, I said, my voice dangerously calm. You chose to bankrupt yourselves to throw Wyatt a $250,000 party. You handed me a $200 check for my wedding. And now, you are demanding I pay off your debts and fund your unemployed husband's imaginary business? Family helps family, Claire, my mother cried out, slamming her hand on the table. You have more money than you could ever spend. It is selfish to hoard it while your sister struggles. My sister is struggling because she demands a lifestyle she cannot afford, I replied coldly. The answer is no. I will not pay off your mortgage. And I am certainly not funding Greg. You are here as guests for my wedding. That is all. I stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. But Wyatt wasn't finished. She stood up too, her eyes blazing with a toxic, furious envy. You are a selfish, miserable brat, she hissed. You think this stupid French castle makes you better than us? You're still just the boring, invisible nerd from the basement. And I promise you, I will not let you use this weekend to make me look small. She stormed out of the sunroom, Greg trailing behind her like an obedient puppy. I looked at my parents, expecting them to apologize for her outburst. Instead, my mother just shook her head in disappointment. You're tearing this family apart over money, Claire, she whispered, before following her golden child out the door. If I thought the breakfast confrontation was the climax of their atrocious behavior, I was sorely mistaken. Over the next 48 hours, Wyatt launched a covert, calculated campaign to hijack my wedding venue. It started on Thursday afternoon, 2 days before the ceremony. I was in the library going over final catering details with Jacqueline when I heard the distinct sound of loud, obnoxious laughter echoing from the main courtyard. I walked to the window and looked down. 3 sleek, rented Range Rovers had pulled onto the gravel driveway. Out poured a half-dozen people dressed in designer resort wear, carrying ring lights, tripods, and oversized Louis Vuitton duffels. I immediately recognized them from Wyatt's endless Instagram feed. It was her inner circle of wannabe influencers. Savannah, Liam, Harper, and a few others whose names I couldn't remember. My blood ran cold. I marched down the stairs and out the heavy oak doors just as Wyatt was dramatically greeting them with air kisses. "Oh my God, Wyatt, your family's summer home is literally insane," Savannah shrieked, spinning around with her phone already recording a vlog. "This is giving major, quiet luxury vibes. We are going to get the most iconic content here." "I know, right?" Wyatt beamed, flipping her hair. "Welcome to Saint Martial, guys. Daddy bought it a few years ago as an investment, but I practically designed the interior." I stopped dead in my tracks. She was claiming my home as our parents' property. She was claiming she designed it. "Wyatt," I said loudly, cutting through the obnoxious chatter. "What is going on here?" Wyatt turned, a sickly sweet, fake smile plastered across her face. "Oh, hey, Claire. Guys, this is my little sister. Anyway, I invited the crew down for the weekend. Since it's a destination trip, I figured we could do a joint celebration. A wedding for you, and a vow renewal for Greg and me. Savannah's boyfriend is a professional photographer, so we're going to do a sunset shoot in the lavender fields tomorrow." I stared at her, genuinely stunned by the sociopathic level of her delusion. She had invited her influencer friends to my private estate, claimed it as her own, and planned to stage a vow renewal on the eve of my wedding to steal the attention. Before I could unleash hell, my mother hurried out of the house, looking flustered but aggressively supportive of Wyatt. "Claire, calm down," Margaret whispered, grabbing my arm and trying to pull me aside. Wyatt asked me if her friends could come, and I said yes. "It's a huge estate. You have plenty of empty rooms. She needs this, Claire. Her engagement on social media has been dropping, and this aesthetic is perfect for her brand. Don't be a bridezilla." "A bridezilla?" I repeated, my voice rising in volume. "Mum, this is my house. These are my guests. She is lying to her friends, telling them Dad owns this place." "Well, it's easier to explain it that way," my mother hissed defensively. "It would be humiliating for her to admit her little sister bought a castle while she's living in a guest bedroom. Just let her have this weekend, Claire. You have the money. You have the man. Let Wyatt have the spotlight. It's only fair." I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and realized the heartbreaking truth. She would never change. She would burn my life to the ground just to keep Wyatt warm. "No," I said, my voice echoing across the courtyard, loud enough for Savannah, Liam, and the entire influencer entourage to hear. Wyatt's fake smile dropped. "Claire, don't cause a scene." "I'm not causing a scene. I'm correcting a delusion," I said, stepping forward. I looked directly at Savannah, whose phone was still recording. "Hi, I'm Claire. I am the sole owner of Château de Saint-Martial. My sister, Wyatt, is unemployed, deeply in debt, and living in my parents' guest room in Connecticut. She does not own this house. My parents do not own this house. Furthermore, none of you are on the guest list for my private wedding this weekend." The silence in the courtyard was deafening. Savannah slowly lowered her phone, her eyes darting between me and a suddenly pale Wyatt. Liam coughed awkwardly. "Wyatt, is that true?" Harper asked, her brow furrowed. "You told us your dad bought this from a French aristocrat." Wyatt's face cycled through shock, humiliation, and finally, explosive rage. "You bitch!" she screamed at me, her hands balled into fists. "You couldn't just let me have one thing. You had to ruin it. You tried to hijack my wedding venue for an Instagram photo shoot." I fired back. "You invited strangers into my home without my permission." "It's a family home," my father bellowed, marching out to join the chaos. "Claire, you are acting like a tyrant. These people traveled a long way. Then they can travel back to Marseille and find a hotel," I said with absolute finality. I turned to Jacqueline, who was standing quietly by the doors with a headset on. "Jacqueline, please call Thomas and David from the security team. Escort these uninvited individuals off the property. If they resist, call the local gendarmerie." The courtyard of Château de Saint-Martial fell into a stunned, heavy silence as the tail lights of the influencers' rented Range Rovers disappeared down the long, cypress-lined driveway. The dust settled over the gravel, but the absolute destruction of Wyatt's carefully manufactured reality hung thickly in the warm French air. She had been exposed, not just as a liar, but as a fraud to the very people she worshipped. For a moment, nobody moved. Wyatt stood frozen, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a manic, unraveling horror. Then she snapped. "You ruined my life!" Wyatt screamed, the sound tearing from her throat with a raw, ugly desperation. She lunged toward me, her manicured hands curled into claws, her face twisted in a mask of pure, venomous hatred. Before she could close the distance, Sebastian stepped smoothly and firmly in front of me, his tall frame completely blocking her path. At the exact same moment, Thomas and David, the two imposing, impeccably dressed private security guards I had hired for the weekend, materialized from the shadows of the portico. David caught Wyatt by the upper arm, not violently, but with an immovable, iron grip that instantly stopped her momentum. "Do not touch my fiancé," Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that I had never heard before. "And do not take another step." "Let go of her!" My father, Richard, bellowed. He puffed out his chest, his face flushing a dangerous mottled purple as he marched down the stone steps. "How dare you lay hands on my daughter? Claire! Call your goons off right now. You have humiliated your sister enough for one day. You are going to apologize. You are going to call those people back, and you are going to explain that there was a misunderstanding." I stepped out from behind Sebastian, feeling a strange, profound sense of absolute calm. For 28 years, my father's raised voice would have sent me shrinking into a corner. I would have folded. I would have apologized to keep the peace. But standing on the grounds of my $14 million estate, having built an empire with my own two hands, his anger looked entirely pathetic. He was just a small, financially ruined man, trying to bully the one person who could actually save him. "Nobody is calling anyone back, Dad," I said, my voice eerily steady. "And the only misunderstanding here is your belief that you have any authority on my property. You demanded I pay off your debts. You demanded I fund Greg's non-existent business. And when I said no, you allowed your golden child to try and turn my private wedding venue into a viral social media stunt. You are parasitic." "Claire! My mother!" Margaret gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. "We are your family. You cannot speak to us this way." "I just did," I replied coldly. "Thomas, David, please assist my parents, my sister, and her husband with their luggage. They have exactly 30 minutes to clear out of the guest suites and vacate the premises." "You can't kick us out!" Greg finally spoke up, his voice cracking with panic. He looked around the vast, isolated countryside of the Luberon Valley. "We're in the middle of nowhere. We don't have a rental car. How are we supposed to get to the airport?" "That sounds like an entrepreneurial problem, Greg," I said, tilting my head. "I'm sure you'll find a solution. Your return flights on Air France, which I paid for, have just been cancelled. You are on your own." The realization hit them like a physical blow. The colour entirely drained from my mother's face. "Claire, please," she stammered, the arrogance instantly evaporating into genuine terror. "We don't have the funds for last-minute international flights. It's the middle of summer. Everything is booked. We don't even have a hotel room for tonight. You should have considered the logistical consequences before you tried to hijack my home," I stated, completely unmoved by her tears. 30 minutes. If you are not off the property by then, Jacqueline has instructions to call the local gendarmerie and have you removed for trespassing." The next half hour was a masterpiece of pathetic chaos. From the courtyard, Sebastian and I watched as my family scrambled frantically. Through the open windows of the guest wing, we could hear Wyatt sobbing hysterically, throwing expensive toiletries into her Louis Vuitton bags, while my father shouted into his cell phone, aggressively trying to argue with a French taxi dispatcher who couldn't understand him. Exactly 28 minutes later, they emerged from the heavy oak doors. Thomas and David flanked them, holding their luggage. Because they couldn't secure a taxi on such short notice to drive out to the private estate, they had to walk. I stood on the stone terrace with Sebastian, sipping a glass of iced lemon water, as I watched my parents, my sister, and my brother-in-law drag their heavy, rolling suitcases down the mile-long gravel driveway. The sound of the wheels crunching against the rocks echoed through the valley. Wyatt, wearing 4-inch designer heels meant for lounging by a pool, kept stumbling, her mascara running down her face in thick, black streaks. My father was sweating profusely, his face red and miserable, as he lugged his massive golf bag, which he had brought, assuming he'd be playing at a nearby country club on my dime. They looked ridiculous. They looked exactly like what they were, grifters who had finally been cut off from their mark. When they finally reached the heavy wrought-iron gates at the end of the property, they didn't look back. The gates slowly swung shut behind them, locking with a heavy, satisfying metallic thud. The toxic cloud that had suffocated my entire life finally lifted. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of lavender and ancient stone filling my lungs. Sebastian wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in my neck. "Are you okay, darling?" he whispered. "I've never been better," I smiled, and for the first time in my life, it was the absolute truth. The following evening, Saturday, was the most spectacular, joy-filled day I could have ever imagined. Without the looming, oppressive weight of my family's judgment and jealousy, my wedding was a pure celebration of love and triumph. The ceremony took place just before sunset, in the heart of the blooming lavender fields. The golden hour light bathed the entire valley in a warm, ethereal glow. A live string quartet played softly as I walked down the aisle. Completely unescorted, holding my head high, I wore a custom, backless silk crepe gown that draped flawlessly, a piece of art that required no approval from my mother or sister. Sebastian stood waiting for me under a floral arch of white roses and olive branches, looking devastatingly handsome in a bespoke tuxedo. When he recited his vows, his voice cracked with emotion, promising to protect me, cherish me, and always be my true family. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Our guests were the people who actually mattered. My brilliant business partners, my fiercely loyal college roommate Beatrice, Sebastian's warm, intellectual family who had welcomed me with open arms, and Harrison, my cutthroat corporate attorney and closest confidant. The reception was a masterpiece of French gastronomy and unbridled joy. We dined on truffles, duck confit, and endless bottles of vintage Bordeaux under a sprawling canopy of fairy lights strung between century-old trees. There was no drama. There was no one complaining about the food, or comparing the centerpieces to a Plaza Hotel extravaganza, or demanding the photographer take pictures of them instead of the bride. During the toasts, Harrison stood up, raising his glass of champagne. "To Claire," he said, his eyes twinkling with a knowing mischief. "A woman who knows how to build an empire, how to throw the party of the century, and, most importantly, how to take out the trash. We love you!" The courtyard erupted in laughter and cheers. We danced until 4 a.m, the music echoing across the Luberon hills, my feet bare on the cool stone, Sebastian spinning me around until I was dizzy with happiness. It was the perfect start to a perfect life. The aftermath for the Harding family, however, was swift, brutal, and entirely of their own making. We later found out through the grapevine that my parents and Wyatt had to walk 3 miles to the nearest village before finding a local bus that took them to a train station, eventually getting them to Marseille. With their credit cards already heavily burdened by Wyatt's wedding debt, they were forced to take out a predatory high-interest cash advance just to buy 3 economy tickets on a budget airline back to Newark. They spent the night sleeping on the floor of the airport terminal, but the travel nightmare was just the beginning of their downfall. The Monday after the wedding, Wyatt's influencer friend, Savannah, uploaded a scathing 30-minute YouTube storytime video titled, "My fake friend lied about owning a $14 M castle." Exposed, Savannah detailed the entire humiliation in the courtyard, gleefully exposing Wyatt's fake wealth, her unemployment, and the fact that she was living in her parents' guest room. The video went massively viral. Wyatt's Instagram sponsors dropped her within 48 hours. Her brand was utterly destroyed, reducing her from a minor social media star to a laughingstock in her circles. Greg, realizing that his wife was now a social pariah and that his father-in-law's bank account was bone dry, packed his bags. 2 months later, he filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. He moved to Florida and immediately started dating a 50-year-old heiress. My parents fared even worse. Without the financial bailout they had banked on extorting from me, the reality of their second mortgage crashed down upon them. 6 months after my wedding, the bank foreclosed on the Stamford house. They lost everything. My father, humiliated and broken, was forced to take an entry-level managerial job at a warehouse just to make ends meet, while my mother had to give up her country club membership and her lavish lifestyle entirely. They moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a less desirable part of New Jersey. Wyatt, broke and divorced, moved right back into their tiny spare room. In a desperate, delusional final attempt at a cash grab, my father actually tried to sue me. He hired a cheap strip mall lawyer and sent me a letter demanding reimbursement for their emotional distress and the cost of their flights home. I didn't even respond. I simply handed the letter to Harrison. Harrison sent back a beautiful 10-page legal manifesto detailing a countersuit for harassment, attempted extortion, and property trespassing. Backed by sworn affidavits from my security team and Jacqueline, he promised to bankrupt them so thoroughly they wouldn't even be able to afford the postage on their next demand letter. We never heard from them again. Today, 3 years later, my life is a masterpiece of peace and prosperity. The software company I built recently went public, securing a legacy of wealth that my parents couldn't even fathom. Sebastian and I split our time between a gorgeous townhouse in London and the sweeping, sun-drenched grounds of Saint-Martial. As I sit here today on the terrace of my French estate, watching our 2-year-old son, Arthur, chase butterflies through the lavender fields while Sebastian sketches in his notebook, I feel no guilt, I feel no regret. I cut out the cancer that was my biological family. And in doing so, I made room for a life that is truly rich, not just in money, but in loyalty, respect, and unconditional love. Sometimes, the most beautiful chapters of your life only begin when you finally close the book on the people who tried to rewrite your story.